Are you trying to figure out if you have enough saved and if it's finally okay for you to retire or not? Or how much you can spend in retirement? When do you start Social Security? Do you start it right away or do you wait a little bit? Are Roth conversions appropriate for you? How much are you going to have to pay in taxes? If you're trying to figure out the answers to these questions, today we're going to go over a real-life client example for somebody who is 65 years old with about $400,000 in retirement savings. And I'm going to show you exactly what it looks like for this person in retirement based on a whole list of factors that I believe it's most important for everybody to consider, regardless of how much or how little money you have saved once it's time for retirement. For starters, I want to tell you a little bit about the client to give you context for the situation before we dive into the numbers and examples. So in this situation, the client is about to turn 65 years old. They have just over $400,000 in pre-tax retirement savings. They don't have a lot of cash assets saved, and there's no other real estate investments other than their primary residence, which they don't have a large mortgage, but they do still have a mortgage payment for a few more years. In this example, the client is widowed and they have one grown child who is off on their own at this point. So we don't have to factor in expenses for children or college savings or things like that into this example. For sake of client and privacy reasons, we've simplified the financial numbers and of course changed the names. So we have Miss Betty Parker. Miss Betty Parker has a net worth of about $600,000. She has pre-retirement assets of just over $400,000. She only has about $10,000 in the bank. She's 64, turning 65 in January in a few months, and she's planning to retire on her 65th birthday. And Miss Betty is wondering if she has enough money in retirement savings to comfortably retire and live life the way that she would like to. Miss Betty has told us that she feels, not including her mortgage, that she still has about $90,000 left on, her insurance payments, her car payments, and any other liabilities, that she spends about $2,000 a month. She said she spent a lot of time traveling early on in life, and so she wants to be able to go to the beach or the mountains maybe once or twice a year, and maybe wants to spend a few $1,000s on those trips, but she's not an extravagant spender. And in addition to that, Miss Betty lives in a small suburb outside of a major metropolitan area. And so those are the specifics of the client situation that we're talking about today. Now, understand that regardless of where you are in life, whether you have a lot more or a lot less than Miss Betty, or are a lot older or a lot younger, the concepts that we're going to go over today still apply and can be used for you to assess your own personal situation. So, let's dive in. So, for Miss Betty, I'll show you here. She has a net worth of a little over $600,000, and she has total investment savings of $465,000. Now, I will tell you that the majority of these investments are all in her IRA, as you can see here. She has a little bit of cash in her bank account, and then she also has a universal life insurance policy that she's had for a very long time that she still pays a small premium on. And so while we are factoring this cash value into Miss Betty's total net worth, this is not going to be a big factor that we're going to consider as far as an asset that she can use for retirement spending, unless it was a true emergency. When we first start working with clients, one of the first things that we're going to take a look at after we've gathered our basic information and had a few client conversations is we're going to look at what we call a cash flow report. A cash flow report is one of my most frequently used reports because no matter how much money you're making or how much you're spending, a cash flow report can tell us a lot about your habits and where you're trending for future retirement and retirement income and savings. So we take a look at the cash flow report. And one of the first things that I want to take a look at, as you can see on the screen here, is the net cash flow. And the reason that I want to look at the net cash flow here is because right in the beginning of our relationship with the client, we're only using information that we've been given by the client. So things like your mortgage payments and insurance premiums, we can get really specific on, right? There's a statement that we can look at to find this information. But for living expenses, we're relying on the client to tell us how much they spend on average throughout the course of a year or over the course of a month. There's not a real good way for us to track this as the advisor in the beginning of the relationship. So we're taking what the client has told us and plugging it into the system. And this is one of the first things I take a look at, because if a client says that they spend X dollars on average each month, and we plug those numbers into our cash flow report here, and it says that, well, based on those numbers and the income and the salary that the client is currently making, that there would be about $20,000 left over at the end of each year, depending on unexpected expenses and things like that. But in general, about $20,000 left over after taxes, expenses, mortgage payments, and everything has been paid that the client has shared with us. And so for me, I take a close look at this because if the client is accurate about their spending, then the net cash flow tells us a lot about how much most folks would have just sitting in the bank as extra cash on hand, readily available for whatever they need to use it for. And what I find working with most clients is that these two things, the amount of net cash flow that we have here and the amount of extra cash they have sitting around in the bank, are directly related. So when I see that someone is projected to have about $20,000 a year in extra cash flow, yet they only have about $10,000 sitting in their bank account, something's not adding up for me. And so this is telling me that most likely the client probably spends a little bit more each month or each year on average than what they think that they've spent. Now, of course, you could say, well, maybe they have a big expense that just happened or something like that, right? And that's okay. But we have a lot of these conversations with folks, and what we find is that if somebody has an accurate picture of how much they're spending, then the number that we're showing as a net cash flow is going to be much more closely related to the extra cash that they have just sitting around in the bank. And this is completely normal. I would say the majority of folks that we speak with spend more on average than what they actually think that they spend. Even if you're somebody who says, well, I spend way too much, we're not relating that to the exact number. And so in general, we find that the number that the clients give us for their average monthly or average annual spending is lower than what it actually is. And so as we move forward with our planning, we'll usually add a little bit of money onto this spending just to give some more room for error. Okay, so after we've taken a look at the cash flow report and we've started to dial in a little bit closer for how much the client is actually spending on a monthly or annual basis, now we can move to the next step where we can start to look at some actual retirement projections. Getting this spending number right is really important because I'm going to show you in a minute how much of an impact spending at X dollars versus X dollars can ultimately have on the long-term projections. And even if we're not close to retirement, your spending projections are very closely and heavily related to the amount that you think that you could save each year to reach your retirement goals. Now, I'll be the first one to say I'm not here to help my clients budget and tell them that they're going out to eat too many times a week or they are spending too much money on clothes. That's not what I do. What we do that's helpful for our clients is just show them the information, and the information that we go over with them, showing them the cash flow reports and explaining to them how the spending and the net income works in relation to how much we can save and or how much we might be able to spend in retirement. That information leads them to their own answers about are they spending too much or where do they maybe need to cut back. Okay, So after we've looked at Miss Betty's cash flow, and we've got a pretty good idea of how much she's spending, how much she's making, what Social Security income is going to look like, assuming she starts it right away, and the impact of taking a little bit of withdrawals from our retirement account right to start retirement, because we don't have any other place to take withdrawals for income in this situation. So after this, now we want to go over and we want to look at a number of different factors that come into play when we're doing retirement projections and trying to figure out how much can I spend in retirement, and am I going to run out of money? Do I have enough money to live out my days without my retirement and investment accounts going to zero? So we want to factor for things like inflation, rates of return, sequence of events, taxes, Roth conversions, when to take Social Security, long-term care types of events, and other unexpected expenses. So that's what we're going to dive into and show you the real life impact of these different factors on a retirement projection. Okay, so right off the bat, we can see that based on what Miss Betty had told us, the projections look pretty good, assuming that we are only spending about $24,000 a year in addition to our other liabilities and insurance premiums. Now, we already talked about this and we said that that doesn't really make sense. So let's go ahead and adjust what Miss Betty's actually spending on her living expenses each year. And let's bump that up to $36,000 a year. And so for starters, you can see that in the early years, this doesn't have a huge impact. It's not drastically changing the long-term projection, but it does make a difference at $36,000. Now, let's creep this up just a little bit more from $36,000 to $40,000 a year. So just an additional $500 a month. And let's see what the impact of that sort of spending has on our long-term projections. So just going from $36,000 a year to $40,000 a year, you can see it has a fairly significant impact on our long-term projections. Now, it looks like, as far as we can tell today, that Miss Betty is still going to live the way that she would like to out to age 95, but we still have a lot of other factors that we really need to consider here to stress test this situation to be able to give Miss Betty a confident answer about whether she can retire in January or not. And so another thing that's really important for us to look at is rates of return. So right now we're being conservative because Miss Betty's a relatively conservative investor, and we're assuming that she makes around 6.5% earnings on her retirement account each year. And so let's bump this down, because let's just say that we have a couple bad years in the stock market and see the impact of that. And so you can see here that if we bump this down to about 5.5% instead of 6.5%, the impact that just an average of 1% less annual average returns can have on a long-term retirement projection. I'll show you this again. We were up here and now just averaging 5.5% instead of something closer to 6.5%. It pulls our value down here about $200,000 as far as what we'd be expected to end up with if we were to live until age 95. But all things considered, it looks like Miss Betty is still in okay shape. Now, let's pull in a few different scenarios, and let's look at something that's called a Monte Carlo simulation. And what a Monte Carlo simulation does for us is it says, well, what's the range of outcomes here for Miss Betty? Even though it might be really unlikely to happen, what are the range of outcomes here for sequence of returns and investment returns over the course of Miss Betty's retirement? And so the Monte Carlo simulation here shows us that, well, in this example, it looks like even on a below average, right, 20% or less likely chance to occur, Miss Betty is still going to end with a few $100,000 in retirement assets at her age 95. So we're looking okay here for right now. So let's pop over back here and let's look at a few other factors. Let's bump our returns back to 6.5%. It's still relatively conservative to use for long-term projections. So we're going to spend about $40,000 a year. Let's say, well, what about, does it make sense for Miss Betty to take Social Security right in the beginning of retirement or not? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Let's take a look. So The scenario here that we plugged in just said, well, what if Miss Betty waits until she's 70 so that her Social Security income dollar amount is higher, but she doesn't have that income in the early years of retirement? Well, we can see here in this situation that this has a drastic impact on Miss Betty's long-term projections, because in the early years of retirement, Miss Betty has to withdraw a lot more from her IRA than what she would if we had that Social Security income to help supplement those withdrawals. Now, you might say, well, Rob, long term, she still ends a few $100,000 in the bank. And that's true. But what I can tell you, and what we find for most folks, is that in the early years, taking Social Security withdrawals has a big impact on our long term projections, because we don't have that Social Security income to supplement our other expenses. So we have to withdraw a much larger amount from our IRA in the early years of retirement. And so even if we're growing at more than 6.5%, we're withdrawing so much that it's tough for the account to fight against those withdrawals and outgrow it. And so you can see how quickly our assets decrease in our early years if we're not taking Social Security income. So in Miss Betty's example, it actually makes more sense for Miss Betty to start Social Security right at age 65 than it would for her to wait until later in life or age 70. So that's one factor to consider, is the timing of Social Security. Now, let's take a look at Roth conversions. This is something that just about every client asks us about. And a lot of folks are curious on, is it okay or is it appropriate for me to do Roth conversions? Should I do this? Is this going to help me out long term? Well, let's take a look. And where we can start before we do Roth conversions is, let's take a look at what our estimated taxes are going to look like in retirement without any Roth conversions, just taking withdrawals as we plan on today. So we can see here that after 2024, Miss Betty's last year of working full time, her effective federal income tax rate is pretty darn low. We're under 10% here on average, with her just taking that $25,000 to $30,000 a year in withdrawals from her account. And so we're in a fairly low tax bracket here. And as we get out later in life and inflation goes up and withdrawals increase and tax brackets go up and things like that over time, Miss Betty's tax brackets actually continue to go down. So we don't really have a tax problem here for Miss Betty. So is it important for us to pay money up front to get it into a Roth IRA and do Roth conversions? Well, let's take a look at the impact. So if Miss Betty were to do, let's say, $50,000 of Roth conversions each year, so that by the time RMDs come around, she has no more money in her IRA and it's all in her Roth IRA where she could withdraw tax-free from, what's the impact of that? Well, in the early years here, it moves her tax bracket up so high, almost double where it was without the Roth conversions, that even though it significantly decreases her taxes later in life, it has such a heavy impact in the early years, and she needs the money to live off of today, that the Roth IRA doesn't have time to grow and accumulate to make up for the taxes that we paid when we did the conversions. And I can show you here on our projections page, this has a really heavy impact for Miss Betty. So in this instance, Roth conversions are not actually better for Miss Betty to do. She's okay just taking withdrawals from her IRA without worrying about any Roth conversions. All right. We can't forget about things like new cars and travel expenses. All of these can have an impact on our retirement. Now, Miss Betty can choose to make decisions like spend less money and travel more, spend less money and buy new cars more frequently, and those all impact the long-term outcomes here. The last thing that I want to discuss that I think is one of the most overlooked for most folks, because we think, well, it won't happen to us, is some sort of a long-term care event where you end up needing to pay at a minimum, a few $1,000s a month extra for some sort of at-home nursing care or retirement home nursing care later in life. And so if something happens to Miss Betty, using the factors that we have plugged in here today, if Miss Betty were to have a long-term care event, let's say at age 80, she has a heart attack, stroke, cancer, something like that, where all of a sudden she's not in a position to take care of herself and she needs to pay for professional care. And at a minimum, let's just say that it costs about $24,000 a year, but she's not out and about living, traveling, so some of the other expenses that we have factored in there can even out. The point is to show you here that if we add that on top of some of our other living expenses, this can have a significant impact on long-term projections. So speaking with an advisor and get a feeling for what's your risk of long-term care. Do you have a way to fund long-term care? Is it something that's important for you? Many people have had to deal with this for their parents themselves, so you're familiar with this situation. It's not something that's going to happen to everyone, but I do think it's important for everybody to consider and address when you're doing your retirement projections. Is that what is your fail-safe if something happens? Where will you fund that expense from? So to wrap up today, we've looked at a lot of different examples here for Miss Betty Parker to show you that there are a lot of different factors that need to be considered when we're looking at retirement projections. And again, starting with the spending and the income that you have today, all the way through the factors that can take place during retirement, regardless of how much or how little you have, all of these things are good to consider when you're assessing your own situation. If you think, wow, these charts and ways to toggle on these different factors to see real live examples of impact on retirement projections, and it's something that you'd like to look at, then there's a link where you can check out our website below and book a time for us to chat to see how we might be able to help you. Thanks a lot for joining today. If you like this video, please like, subscribe below. We'll be releasing these once a week, every week, so that you can see what more live client situations look like and compare them to what you have going on in your own life. Thanks a lot and have a great day.